Folks, it's time to talk about democracy. Democracy, 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 democracy. I love democracy. I love it. I love it. It's such an amazing system. I'm so glad I live in a democracy. I'm so glad I live in a democracy. Today, there are 195 countries in the world, of which only 7 do not claim to be democracies. Which means that the other 188, or 96% of all countries on Earth, do claim to be democracies. Even countries like North Korea, world renowned for being an extremely authoritarian regime, still call themselves the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And well, I suppose they technically aren't wrong. North Korea does, after all, have elections, such as the 2009 election, where the Fatherland Front got 100% of the vote, or the 2014 election, where the Fatherland Front got 100% of the vote, or the 2019 election, where the Fatherland Front got 100% of the vote. I'm starting to see a pattern here. The Kim family sure does spawn some popular politicians. Of course, elections such as these aren't really considered legitimate, and are merely what's known as show elections, mainly because they often have either only one candidate to vote for, or are so absurdly unfair that they may as well anyway. And such show elections aren't exactly anything new. Even going as far back as before World War II, the numerous Axis powers to be would have a myriad of show elections and votes. Such as perhaps most blatantly the 1938 referendum, whereby voters were asked if they supported the reunification of Austria and Germany, with the yes option being represented by a large circle in the middle of the ballot, and the no option being represented by a much smaller circle off to the side of the ballot, which definitely wasn't biased at all. This, as well as the fact large swaths of the population were simply prohibited from voting, resulted in a yes victory by a staggering 99.73% of the vote. Which, considering it's difficult to get 99 out of 100 people to agree on borderline anything, never mind matters of national sovereignty, makes such a result at least rather questionable. But by far the most absurd show election of all time is widely considered to be the 1927 Liberian election that was between 2 men, Charles King and Thomas Faulkner. Liberia at the time was said to have around 15,000 registered voters, and when the results came in, Thomas Faulkner was reported to get around 9,000 votes. So you'd think then that Charles King must have only got the remaining 6,000, making Thomas Faulkner the winner. But no, as apparently Charles King somehow got over 240,000 votes. Where did all these votes come from? Well, exactly. Having an election with a voter turnout of 1,660% is truly quite an achievement indeed. So much so that Charles King even ended up being listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the most fraudulent election victory in recorded history. The fact that even blatantly dictatorial or corrupt regimes feel the need to masquerade as democracies showcases the main reason why democracy, as a form of government, is viewed as so prestigious. Because a government that represents the will of its people is a government that must also be of the people, and thus justifies its own existence, making its legitimacy very hard to challenge, both internally and externally, a dividend that other forms of government almost never get to enjoy. Hence why democracy is held in such high regard and, in the case of the Western world, proudly flaunted and even romanticised to a very extreme degree. I love democracy. 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 I love. However, as we can see by taking even a brief glance at much of the Western world, democracy is by no means a perfect system, and has some very blatant and not so blatant flaws. Flaws that, in our pride of not being a dictatorship, are almost always swept under the rug out of convenience. Almost as if we're too scared to admit them, dare we rock the boat too much. But I love to rock the boat. Hence why I think it's about time that we challenge such hesitancy by analysing the downsides of democracy accordingly. Starting with number 1, equal voting power. Winston Churchill once said that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. And he really wasn't wrong. Let's say there were 2 guys. First, you have Steve. Hello, I'm Steve. He's a successful businessman who employs hundreds of people, a loving husband and father to his offspring, and is known to often donate millions of his own money to local charities in order to help those less fortunate than him. Then, you have Bill.
Hey, I'm Bill.
He is known to spend all day watching anime, has a passion for tangy cheese Doritos, and enjoys spending his nights talking to teenagers on Discord. I think it goes without saying that Steve obviously contributes much more to society than Bill does. And yet despite this, in the typical democracy, Steve and Bill both have the exact same voting power, of 1 vote each. This is because voting power in the typical democracy is not determined by things such as intelligence, generosity, usefulness, or practically any other trait we use to usually judge people by, but instead merely existing as an adult, which, let's face it, isn't exactly that high of a bar. Granted, it would be extremely difficult, invasive, and obviously controversial to assign people different voting powers, and an almost never-ending battle to get everyone to agree on what such criteria should even be. But the idea that everyone should have equal voting power, despite the people themselves not being equal, can only really be described as a sort of utopian idealism. Even putting aside judging people as a whole, democracy doesn't even concede the fact that some citizens may be more knowledgeable about certain individual topics than other citizens. Taking even a few seconds to browse social media and seeing people boldly declare to the world their not very well thought out opinions that are overwhelmingly exclusively emotionally charged about topics you know way more about is enough to sour anyone's sanity. Especially when you realise they have just as much of a say about such a topic as you do. Of course, no one wants to be ruled by an elitist group of experts, especially in times like these with the corruption of institutions such as education and the media, whereby what it means to qualify as an expert is essentially just being an ignorant fart sniffer of the status quo. But nevertheless, prioritising equality over expertise is almost guaranteed to tangibly manifest over time in less than ideal outcomes, especially proving true in nations whereby talent can easily move to more prosperous places, thus lowering the quality of the average even more so. This isn't an opinion, it's a fact. And this example, even if a very extreme comparison, makes almost everyone subconsciously aware that there's clearly just something not right about this at all. A blatant downside of democracy. Which brings us on to number 2. Short-term obsessions. Politicians have a shelf life comparable to milk, and they know it. Elected officials who underperform can be, and often are, very quickly replaced. And as such, politicians frequently find themselves being obsessively focused on the short term in order to keep their voters happy, and thus stay in power. But this mindset can often come at the cost of long-term chaos. As let's say that Steve and Bill both became politicians and were running against each other in an election. In their fictional country, the biggest topic the public is concerned with is climate change, whereby in order to switch to renewable energy, the nation aims to have all cars be 100% electric as soon as possible. However, as of right now, only 20% of cars are electric, so how are they going to get from here to there? Well, Steve, being a reasonable man, says, "Let's slowly start to subsidise electric cars for those who can't afford them over the next decade, until the 100% target is inevitably reached." Not a bad policy. But Bill, being a complete dumbo, says, "If I win the election, my administration will buy everyone a free Tesla to reach that 100% target on day 1.
Yeah, man.
Now this policy is obviously borderline insane, as it would put the nation in massive amounts of debt. However, when the electorate is basically faced with the choice of either "I'll make sure your next car is a bit cheaper sometime over the next 10 years," or "I will buy you a state-of-the-art car on day one of my presidency," it shouldn't exactly be too surprising which choice seems more appetizing. And so, Bill wins the election in a landslide, everyone gets their free day one Tesla, and the nation celebrates their massive progress against the menace of climate change. Only for 10 years down the line, massive cuts to the healthcare system, education system, and ironically, the road infrastructure have to occur, in order to make up for the massive amounts of debt that the country is now in. All of this because the voters only focused on the short-term gains rather than the long-term pains of the policies that were put in front of them. A mindset which only incentivizes politicians to keep prioritizing the short term, because evidently, it's what is best rewarded by voters. And again, while this is of course a completely over-the-top example, this kind of short-term thinking is genuinely extremely dominant within most democracies, just to a much lesser degree. As seen by taking just one glance at the ever-increasing real national debt that many countries now have, due to not prioritizing the long term at all. A blatant downside of democracy. Which brings us on to number 3. Tribal polarization. Nation-states were made to exist as a family of families, united by a common culture, universal values, and shared history. But democracy takes a sledgehammer to all such things, because the system incentivizes dividing people up into different groups, and having them fight amongst each other, rather than coalescing as one. Leading to absolutely massive divides in public opinion over a myriad of endless topics, many of which likely would never have even been a problem had the opportunity to parade them not been incentivized and fostered in the first place. This is especially true in places where there are a large number of religions due to contrasting and conflicting values, or places where religion isn't known to play a core role in people's lives at all, with everyone having a different opinion on everything as a result. Ironically, in the latter, politics can often end up filling the void of religion, whereby people unintentionally end up defending their newfound political tribes with the same zeal as a religious person would their religion, leading to different groups of people despising each other based on such factional lines, despite the fact they may have never even spoken to each other personally.
We want Steve! We want Steve!
We want Bill! We want Bill! Steve supporters and Bill supporters may actually find a lot of common ground if they just took the time to talk. But as such, tribes can be manipulated by media and social media apparatuses, of whom directly profiteer from such conflicts via the attention they receive from them. Such differences are often only exacerbated even further, making communication impossible via the demonization of the other, which, if left unaddressed for too long, can lead to even more polarization, calls for independence, or potentially even civil wars. A weakness that can easily be exploited by rival states, who can use social engineering or propaganda to help steer such divides even further, destroying their enemies, not from the outside, but the inside. There's a good reason why in his farewell address to the nation, the first president of the United States, George Washington, warned against the creation of political parties. Because tribalistic disunity can often lead nations down the path to dissolution via an environment of constant conflict. And the amount of psychological damage this kind of environment can do to people, especially children who grow up within them, is genuinely baffling. As when it becomes the norm to start to see even your own neighbours as potential enemies, then this creates a feeling of tension that doesn't even disappear when in the comforts of your own home, putting people in a constant state of paranoia, hysteria, and rage, which is, needless to say, never a good thing. A blatant downside of democracy. Which brings us on to number 4, the personality of politicians. When it comes to politicians, we have to ask ourselves the question: who in their right mind would actually want to be one? Everything about you is out in the public eye, from your identity, appearance, history, relationship, family, etc. You'd be spending the vast majority of time publicly battling it out with political rivals, while also trying not to get backstabbed by your own side in tandem. And no matter how polite of a person you are, a large chunk of the population is just going to hate you, simply for being in your political faction alone. Being stalked by the media, constantly made fun of, and blamed for practically everything that goes wrong, makes being a politician an incredibly stressful, invasive, and thankless job. That, as a result, the vast majority of people wouldn't even dream of trying to do. And because of this hostile environment, via the laws of elimination, we can conclude that almost all people who go on to become successful politicians, no matter the faction, are overwhelmingly likely to have three common personality traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, also known as the Dark Triad. Machiavellianism, because you have to be able to effectively manipulate others in order to do well in politics at all. Narcissism, because you have to be pretty self-obsessed to actually have the goal to put yourself out there to the public in the first place. And psychopathy, because you have to be lacking in things like sympathy, empathy, and self-reflection in order to keep going. All in all, meaning that the kinds of people who are the most successful in politics may not necessarily be the best people for the job, but merely those ruthless enough to claim to be and survive the stressful climate. Steve may be a genius, but he also has a heart, caring a lot about what people say about him, and, as a result, may back out of politics altogether. Whereas Bill, being a heartless bastard, doesn't give a damn what people think, and will thus continue onwards, even if he's a blatantly inferior candidate. And that really is the point here. Too many times do people make politics personal, left-wingers obsessing over how much they despise right-wing politicians, or right-wingers obsessing over how much they despise left-wing politicians. But in reality, such politicians as people aren't really the problem, as when they retire, someone else just like them will only take their place. As the real problem is actually the underlying environment that makes it so only the most deranged of people actually go on to become successful politicians in the first place. If you study the Roman emperors of old, you'll notice that a large percentage of them either died on the battlefield fighting alongside their troops, or committed suicide due to failing to lead them accordingly, meaning that these were leaders who were often both brave for their people and loyal to their land. But as the centuries passed, monarchs would take the role of head of state, whereby it slowly became less common to see kings fight on the front lines, meaning that such leaders were no longer often brave for their people, but were still, due to their inherited dynasty, nevertheless loyal to their land. But today with democracy, leaders are merely selected temporarily, based on who has the most manipulative, ruthless, and competitive personality. Meaning that most leaders today are not only no longer brave for their people, but often aren't even necessarily loyal to their land. With every new iteration of how we select our leaders, we've ended up with more cowardly and treacherous people, culminating in today, whereby we now have a system that has been accidentally designed to select the worst of people to power, while simultaneously deselecting the best of people away from power. A blatant downside of democracy. Which brings us on to number 5, slow decision making. Democracies are often designed in such a way that no one person, not even the head of state, has too much power. And one such way this is done is via what's known as the separation of powers. This is where the government is split up into 3 independent branches. The legislative branch, responsible for making laws, such as a Congress or Parliament. The executive branch, responsible for enforcing laws, such as a president or prime minister. And the judicial branch, responsible for interpreting laws, such as courts and judges. The separation of powers makes it much less likely that totalitarianism can ever become dominant within the nation, because it would have to somehow bypass a complex and lengthy series of checks and balances in order to do so. The downside of this, however, is that because of such checks and balances, actually governing on a day-to-day basis can become needlessly slow, dramatic, and, in many cases, useless. Let's say you're in the legislative branch and you want to pass a law that temporarily increases corporation tax to 50% to try and generate some income to pay off that terrible national debt. After a series of lengthy debates, you pass the legislation and then pass it to the executive branch, aka President Bill, who you expect to sign it into law. However, Bill vetoes your legislation and says,
50%? No way, man. That's too high. I'd end up losing too much corporate support in the upcoming election if I passed this. You're gonna have to get that down. Big time.
So you and the rest of the legislative have a big debate and eventually agree to get it down to just 40%, whereby you then pass it back to Bill over at the executive, who is then finally satisfied, signing it into law.
Great job, kid.
However, then Steve, who now works over at the judicial branch, gets a hold of it and points out a glaring flaw.
My condolences, but I'm afraid that this legislation is actually unconstitutional.
As it turns out, such legislation violates paragraph 25B of the 69th Amendment, where it clearly states that no corporation can be taxed more than 1/3 of its profits by the state, forcing you in the legislature to lower it down to 30%, passing it back to the executive to sign once again, whereby only then is the judiciary finally satisfied, taking absolutely forever to pass the law, of which is only just over half as effective as what you originally wanted it to be. This snail's pace speed of government may be a security dividend against potential tyranny, but it can also prove to unintentionally be a cause of it. Not a tyranny of control, but complacency. As from separating power too much, all it takes is one attention-seeking bureaucrat seeking their 15 minutes of fame to hold up the entire process of what should otherwise be a simple matter of identifying problems and manifesting solutions. And from taking too long to fix such problems, they may unnecessarily spiral out of hand further, creating a domino effect of disasters that cannot be chased down quick enough. A blatant downside of democracy. Which brings us on lastly to number 6. Party capture. Political parties are prone to manipulation by what's known as special interests. This is where organised groups with large amounts of financial resources, such as corporations within an industry, get together to influence a party's agenda, leading them to prioritise policies that primarily benefit such special interests, rather than doing what's good for the public at large, in essence, capturing the party. Party capture is especially dangerous in countries such as the US and UK that have a first-past-the-post voting system, and thus only really 2 relevant parties. As the less parties there are, the more easy it is to capture them both, putting the public in an almost unwinnable situation. Let's say that Steve and Bill are running for election again, where on the topic of mass migration, Steve's party is against it because it lowers wages via higher competition for the working class, whereas Bill's party supports it, publicly because it's good, but privately because his special interest corporate donors benefit from mass migration precisely because it lowers wages. Steve's party position is obviously better for the general public. However, because Bill's party has the financial backing of special interest groups, they are able to spend more money to make Steve's party look bad. And because the political party that spends the most money per election cycle is overwhelmingly the one that tends to win, Steve's party realised that they too need more capital. And so, Steve's party makes a similar deal with such special interests, forcing them to follow in lockstep. Meaning that both Steve's party and Bill's party have now been captured, with an identical policy position, with the public essentially being screwed no matter who they vote for. And this happens with not just topics such as mass migration, but practically anything where wealth can be gained through such manipulations, essentially turning the entire democratic process into just picking what your favourite colour rosette is. A blatant downside of democracy. Gee, I'm not gonna lie, fellas. I don't know what that idiot from earlier was talking about when he said he loved democracy. This looks like a nightmare. Equal voting power, short-term obsessions, tribal polarization, the personality of politicians, slow decision-making, and party capture. These flaws are all significant and are yet almost never even mentioned in the public sphere at all. But why? Well, as alluded to earlier, another Churchill quote of "democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others" pretty much summarises the average person's view of the system rather succinctly. It's not because people believe democracy is perfect, but rather that people are so fearful of the alternatives that could come from challenging it that it causes people to clutch their pearls as a knee-jerk response to anyone who dares try and do so. "We must defend our democracy! We must defend our democracy!" say such people in the face of critique. But have they even considered that unless such flaws are addressed, then democracy is always doomed to inevitably collapse? And it's because of people like them. This is what I call the cycle of democratic decline, whereby, during the early stage of a democracy, it performs well, emphasizing rigorous standards of transparency, inclusion, and results. But after many generations, the democracy begins to stagnate and decline due to such listed downsides, whereby transparency collapses, inclusion becomes exclusion, and results start to cease. This decline eventually creates an out-of-touch elitist environment ripe for a populist revolt, whereby the common man starts to look at totalitarian alternatives, such as what was seen with the fascist or communist regimes that we mocked earlier. After all, under such systems, there is no equal voting power, because there's no voting at all. There is no short-term obsessions, because there's no term limits. There is no tribal polarization, because alternative views aren't tolerated. There is no personality of politicians, because politicians aren't elected. There is no slow decision-making, because there is no bureaucracy. And there is no party capture, because there's only ever one almighty party. When the downsides of democracy become blatant, even dictatorships become appealing to the common man, with the underlying logic being that they want a strong, all-powerful leader who represents them to put such out-of-touch elites in line. Which is exactly what happens, often to terrible results, whereby after a period of gargantuan suffering, we eventually end up right back at square one to a democracy once again. Repeat ad infinitum. Overall meaning that while dictatorships are a quick death, then democracies with such flaws are but a slow death. Preferable, of course, but ultimately the same conclusion. Because without such flaws being addressed, they are unknowingly intrinsically linked. And while some may be quick to say that if one has no improvements or alternatives to offer, then such criticisms are ultimately pointless, let it be known that many could easily be listed, but providing such would only be a complete waste of time without first addressing this glaring paradox. As it's rather ironic how, in democracies, a system supposedly designed to support free and open discussion, such a rule quickly wavers when it comes to discussing the actual system itself. And unless this hypocrisy is shattered, then this cycle is only doomed to continue, and what's more, likely in the not too immediate future. So please, let's stop pretending like democracy is immune from critique. It needs to be critiqued, and its downsides need to be highlighted in order to stop this cycle. Democracy, in its current form, desperately needs some democratic treatment. Sadly, I think it's going to be a long time until people feel comfortable even admitting such flaws, never mind wanting to fix them. Until then, however, from me, Steve, and Bill, have a good one.